The courtroom had never been so quiet. The tension was thick, almost suffocating, as all eyes locked onto the small girl seated on the witness stand. The judge's gavel rested in his hand, hovering just above the bench. The defense attorney, a man who had spent decades practicing law, looked utterly stunned. Even the hardened prosecutors seemed caught off guard. The little girl, Emily Thompson, gripped her worn-out stuffed bunny tightly in her arms. The fabric was faded, its fur matted from years of being her constant companion. But she clung to it like a lifeline, her small fingers clutching its ears as if drawing strength from its presence. Her feet barely touched the ground, and yet her voice held steady. "I said," she repeated, looking the attorney in the eye, "my daddy didn't do it. But I know who did." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Jurors shifted in their seats. Emily's mother, seated behind the defense table, covered her mouth with shaking hands as silent tears streamed down her cheeks. Her father, hunched over at the defense table, looked up with something he hadn't shown in weeks: hope. For the first time in months, a flicker of light returned to his weary eyes. The prosecutor fumbled with his notes. The defense attorney leaned forward. The judge finally spoke. "Miss Thompson," his voice was measured, but there was no disguising the intrigue. "Are you saying you have knowledge of what actually happened?" Emily nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. And I can prove it." The courtroom erupted. People murmured, whispering to one another. The judge slammed his gavel. "Order! Order in the court!" But the tension was impossible to contain. It had been 3 months since Emily's world turned upside down. Just a few weeks earlier, she had been just another 8-year-old girl living in a quiet town in Illinois. Her father, Matt Thompson, was her hero. He was the kind of dad who never missed a bedtime story, who let her eat ice cream before dinner on special occasions, and who danced with her in the kitchen when her favorite song came on. Life had been simple, full of laughter, love, and warmth. Until the night everything changed. The flashing lights came first. Red and blue filled their front yard as sirens wailed through the night. She still remembered the way the shadows stretched long across the walls of her living room, the way her mother's face turned pale as she opened the door. And then came the shouting. The police barged in, their presence overwhelming, their voices firm and unwavering. "Matthew Thompson, you're under arrest." Emily had run down the stairs in her pajamas, her heart pounding in her chest. "Daddy?" Her father barely had time to turn before officers grabbed him, forcing his arms behind his back. "Daddy," she screamed, trying to rush forward, but her mother caught her just in time, wrapping her arms around her, holding her back as her body trembled. "It's okay, sweetheart," her mother whispered, though her voice was far from steady. "It's going to be okay." But it wasn't okay. It wasn't okay at all. The charges were grave: attempted murder. Their neighbor, Robert Richards, had been attacked in his home late that night and left unconscious. The police had found Matt's fingerprints on the back door. Even worse, his wallet had been discovered at the scene. The evidence was overwhelming, and the town quickly turned against them. Overnight, their once friendly neighbors avoided eye contact. Sarah, Emily's mother, could feel people staring when she walked into the grocery store. The parents of Emily's classmates whispered when she passed by at school. Emily's best friend stopped sitting next to her at lunch. Her father swore he was innocent. He pleaded with the authorities, with his lawyer, with anyone who would listen. But the town had already made up its mind. And so had the prosecutor. Emily didn't understand legal arguments or evidence. She didn't know what a trial truly meant. But she knew one thing: her dad hadn't done it. And if no one else could prove it, then she would. For weeks, she had watched, listened, and paid attention to details others ignored. She had taken notes in her little pink diary, writing down everything she overheard. And she had noticed something no one else had. Now, here she was, standing in a courtroom full of adults, and the truth was about to come out. If you were in Emily's shoes, what would you do? Would you trust that justice would prevail? Or would you take matters into your own hands, determined to fight for someone you love? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe that truth always finds a way, hit that like button, share this story, and make sure to subscribe for more stories of resilience, courage, and justice. The night had started out like any other. The warm glow of the living room lamp illuminated the cozy home where the Thompsons lived. Emily had been curled up on the couch with her stuffed bunny, listening to her father read a bedtime story. Her mother, Sarah, hummed softly in the kitchen as she washed the last of the dinner dishes. It was an ordinary, peaceful night. Until the knock at the door shattered everything. The sound was loud, urgent. 3 hard knocks that made the walls tremble. Sarah glanced at Matt, her brow furrowed in concern. It was late, too late for visitors. Matt hesitated before standing, setting the book aside. Emily watched him go, a strange unease settling in her stomach. When Matt opened the door, everything happened so fast. Flashing red and blue lights flooded the front yard. Several officers stood at the doorstep, their expressions grave. Emily barely had time to process what was happening before they moved in. "Matthew Thompson, you are under arrest." The words hit like a thunderclap. Emily froze, gripping her stuffed bunny tighter. Sarah rushed forward, panic in her voice. "There must be a mistake. What's going on?" The officer's voice was firm. "Mr. Thompson is being taken into custody for the attempted murder of Robert Richards." Sarah gasped, stumbling back. Emily felt her breath hitch. She didn't understand everything, but she knew Mr. Richards. He was their neighbor, an older man who lived 2 houses down. He had always been kind, always greeted them with a smile. The words didn't make sense. Her dad wouldn't hurt anyone. "This is ridiculous," Matt protested. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sir, we have evidence tying you to the scene," the officer stated, motioning for the handcuffs. "Please cooperate." Emily watched in horror as her father's hands were forced behind his back. The metallic click of the cuffs sent a shiver down her spine. She rushed forward. "Daddy." "No." Sarah tried to hold her back, her own face stricken with shock. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, though her voice cracked under the weight of her own disbelief. "It's going to be okay." But it wasn't okay. It wasn't okay at all. The officers led Matt out the door, his head held high despite the accusations thrown at him. Neighbors had gathered outside, watching. Some whispered to each other. Others just stared. Emily felt their eyes on her, judging, questioning. She felt the ground beneath her shift, as though her world was no longer steady. Sarah quickly wrapped an arm around Emily and pulled her inside. She locked the door behind them, pressing her back against it as though she could shut out the reality of what had just happened. The days that followed were filled with silence. The house felt empty without Matt's laughter, without his warmth. Sarah was constantly on the phone, talking to lawyers, trying to make sense of it all. Emily tried to be strong, but school became unbearable. Whispers followed her wherever she went. "Did you hear about her dad? He almost killed someone. I bet he's guilty. My mom says people like that always pretend to be nice." Emily wanted to scream that it wasn't true, that her dad was innocent. But the words never came. Her best friend stopped sitting with her at lunch. The teachers gave her sympathetic looks but said nothing. Even the neighbors who used to wave at her now turned away. She had never felt so alone. At night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, gripping her stuffed bunny tight. She wanted her dad to come home. She wanted everything to go back to the way it was. But deep down, she knew things would never be the same again. Emily sat by her bedroom window, staring at the empty street outside. The world had moved on, but she couldn't. Her father was still behind bars, accused of something he hadn't done. Her mother barely spoke, drowning in the weight of their new reality. Emily knew that if she didn't do something, no one would. She opened the small pink diary she kept hidden under her mattress. It had started as a simple journal, a place where she wrote down her thoughts, but now it had become something more, a record of everything she had seen, heard, and suspected. If no one else was looking for the truth, she would. She flipped through the pages, retracing her own memories. The night her father was taken away played over and over in her mind like a broken film reel. The flashing lights. The stunned expression on his face. The neighbors whispering. And then she remembered something, a small detail she had overlooked before. Mr. Richards' security camera. Her heart pounded as she sat up straight. A few days before the attack, she had seen someone messing with the camera outside Mr. Richards' house. At the time, she had assumed it was being repaired. But now, knowing what she knew, the memory felt different. More sinister. Why would someone tamper with a security camera right before an attack? She needed to check if the police had looked into it. But how? The next day, she followed her mother to the courthouse. Sarah had gone to meet with her father's lawyer, but Emily had her own mission. She wandered down the hallways, peeking into offices until she saw what she was looking for, a stack of files sitting on the edge of a desk in an empty room. Heart pounding, she stepped inside and scanned the papers. One had Mr. Richards' name on it. She hesitated only a second before flipping through it. The evidence list included fingerprints, witness testimonies, and the security camera. It had been found damaged, its footage erased. The police had written it off as a coincidence. Emily knew better. She hurried back home, her mind racing. Someone had erased that footage on purpose, but why? And who had the most to gain from her father being blamed? That night, she made a list in her diary. The missing footage. The wallet found at the scene. The strange man she had seen near Mr. Richards' house a few days before the attack. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she was getting closer. She just had to prove it. The next day at school, she overheard two teachers talking. One of them mentioned that Mr. Richards had been arguing with a business associate just days before the attack. Emily's ears perked up. Could this be connected? After school, she made her way to the park where she often saw Mr. Richards walking. If she was lucky, she might find someone who knew him well enough to tell her more. She spotted an older woman sitting on a bench, feeding the birds. Emily hesitated before approaching her. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said softly. "Did you know Mr. Richards?" The woman looked up, her eyes kind but curious. "I did. Why do you ask, dear?" Emily sat beside her. "I just wanted to know if he had any enemies. Someone who might have wanted to hurt him." The woman sighed. "He was a stubborn man. Had a few disagreements over the years. I remember him getting into a heated argument with someone at the coffee shop last week." Emily's pulse quickened. "Do you know who it was?" The woman nodded. "A man named Baldwin. He was furious about something. Said Richards owed him." Emily swallowed hard. That name. She had heard it before. Mr. Baldwin lived a few blocks away. She had seen him talking to the police the night of the attack, claiming he had nothing to do with it. But what if he was lying? That night, Emily recorded everything in her diary. She was onto something, but the real question was, who would believe an 8-year-old girl? The courtroom was filled to capacity. The air was thick with tension, the murmur of voices creating an undercurrent of anticipation. The judge sat high on the bench, his expression unreadable. The jury members shifted in their seats, their faces a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. At the defense table, Matt Thompson sat, his hands clenched into fists, his shoulders stiff. Across from him, the prosecutor stood, adjusting his tie, a smirk of confidence playing at the corner of his mouth. Then, the bailiff called her name. "Emily Thompson, please take the stand." A hushed whisper rippled through the room as the 8-year-old girl, clutching her worn-out stuffed bunny, stood up from the spectators section. She walked with small, determined steps toward the witness stand, her feet barely making a sound on the polished wood floor. Sarah, her mother, gripped the edge of the pew, her knuckles white. This was it. This was the moment that could change everything. Emily climbed into the chair, her legs too short to reach the ground, and hugged her bunny to her chest. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Miss Thompson, do you understand what it means to tell the truth?" Emily nodded, her voice soft but clear. "Yes, Your Honor." "Good. Please tell us what you know." The defense attorney approached, his voice gentle. "Emily, can you tell us where you were the night your father was taken away?" Emily took a breath, steadying herself. "I was at home. We had just finished dinner. Daddy read me a bedtime story, and then I went to bed. But I couldn't sleep. I heard the sirens. And then they took him away." The prosecutor stepped forward. "Emily, do you know why your father was arrested?" She nodded. "They said he hurt Mr. Richards. But he didn't." The prosecutor's eyebrows lifted slightly. "And how do you know that?" Emily's grip on her bunny tightened. "Because I saw something. Something nobody else saw." The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Even the judge seemed to be leaning in. The prosecutor crossed his arms. "And what exactly did you see?" Emily glanced at her mother for reassurance before turning back. "I saw someone near Mr. Richards' house a few nights before. He was messing with the security camera. And I remember what he looked like." "Who was it?" the defense attorney asked, his voice careful. Emily pointed a small finger across the room. "It was Mr. Baldwin." A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. A man sitting in the audience, neatly dressed in a dark suit, suddenly stiffened. His face paled. The prosecutor turned, his eyes narrowing. "Objection. She's just a child. She could be mistaken." The judge held up a hand. "Overruled. Continue, Miss Thompson." Emily turned back to the jury, her voice unwavering. "He was there, I know he was. And I heard him talking to someone on the phone. He was angry. He said something about making sure Mr. Richards couldn't say anything." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Mr. Baldwin's lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than the imagination of a child." The judge slammed his gavel. "Order in the court." But it was too late. Mr. Baldwin was visibly sweating. His fingers tapped against the wooden pew in front of him. Then, as if realizing all eyes were on him, he stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous. She doesn't know what she's talking about." The prosecutor turned to him, his expression shifting. "Mr. Baldwin, if you have nothing to hide, then why are you so nervous?" Baldwin opened his mouth, then closed it again. His lawyer tried to pull him back down into his seat, but he shoved him away. "This is a setup. That man is guilty. I had nothing to do with it." The room was in chaos. The judge called for order again, but Emily just watched, her heart pounding. She had done it. She had said the truth, and now, for the first time, it looked like someone actually believed her. The prosecutor turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, given the witness's testimony, I request an immediate review of the evidence regarding Mr. Baldwin." The judge nodded gravely. "Court is adjourned until further notice." Emily climbed down from the witness stand, running into her mother's waiting arms. Sarah held her tightly, pressing a kiss against her hair. "You were so brave, sweetheart. You did it." Matt, still seated at the defense table, locked eyes with his daughter. There were tears in his eyes. Tears of hope. The courtroom remained in stunned silence. Mr. Baldwin, pale and visibly shaking, stood frozen as the weight of Emily's words settled over him. His carefully curated facade cracked, and for the first time, fear crept into his eyes. Emily sat still in the witness chair, her small fingers wrapped around the worn fabric of her stuffed bunny. She had done it. She had spoken the truth. Now, the rest was up to the court. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Your Honor," he said, his voice firm, "in light of this new testimony, I request an immediate review of the evidence concerning Mr. Baldwin's involvement in this case." The judge nodded gravely. Motion granted. This court will recess until further investigation is completed. But Baldwin was no longer sitting still. His breathing had become erratic, his fingers twitching against the desk. Suddenly, he shot up. This is absurd. You're going to take the word of a child? She's lying. His lawyer tried to calm him, but Baldwin shoved him away, his chest rising and falling rapidly. I did nothing wrong. This is a setup. But his voice lacked conviction, his words tumbling over each other. His panic betrayed him. The bailiffs moved in quickly, stepping forward as Baldwin tried to back away. His face twisted in anger, then in desperation. You don't understand, he said, but his words were barely audible. This was never supposed to happen. The entire courtroom watched as reality began to settle in around him. He was caught. He knew it. And Emily, the small girl in the witness stand, had been the one to bring it all to light. Days later, after Baldwin was officially taken into custody for further questioning, new evidence began to surface. The missing security footage? Recovered. Baldwin's fingerprints? Found on tampered files in Mr. Richards' home. And then came the biggest revelation of all, a financial trail that linked Baldwin directly to a secret transaction with Richards weeks before the attack. Emily listened quietly as her father's lawyer explained it all. Baldwin had been funneling money from a failed business deal. When Mr. Richards threatened to expose him, Baldwin panicked. He needed a scapegoat. And your father. He trailed off, shaking his head. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Matt Thompson sat across the table, his face unreadable. It had been weeks since his arrest, and the toll of it showed in the deep lines on his face. But there was something else there now, a glimmer of relief. So it's over? He asked quietly. His lawyer hesitated. Almost. But we're close. Emily sat beside her mother, her legs swinging slightly under the table. She wanted to feel happy, wanted to celebrate. But something felt different. It wasn't just about winning. It was about what had been lost. The trial resumed the following week, but the energy in the courtroom had shifted. With Baldwin's involvement exposed, the prosecution had no choice but to drop the charges against Matt Thompson. When the judge finally spoke those words, "The defendant is hereby cleared of all charges," Sarah gasped audibly, grabbing Matt's hand. He squeezed it back, his face still numb with disbelief. Emily barely processed the words before she felt herself being scooped up into her father's arms. "You did it," he whispered into her hair. "You saved me." She buried her face into his shoulder, feeling the warmth she had missed so much. "I just told the truth." But the truth had come at a cost. Weeks passed. Life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. The neighbors, once wary and full of whispers, now avoided eye contact out of shame. The kids at school, who had once ignored Emily, now gave her wide-eyed glances, some even calling her brave. But she didn't feel brave. She felt older. As if she had seen something she couldn't unsee. One afternoon, she sat outside on the porch, flipping through the pages of her diary. So much had changed since that first entry. Her father was free. The real villain had been exposed. But she felt different now, as if she had lost a piece of herself in the process. Her father stepped outside, settling into the chair beside her. "You okay, kiddo?" She nodded slowly. "Yeah. Just thinking." Matt studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You grew up a lot these past few months. I wish you hadn't had to." Emily shrugged. "I just did what I had to do." He reached over, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "That's what makes you special, Em. You saw what no one else did. You never gave up." She smiled, just a little. "I guess." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun dip behind the trees. Then, her father spoke again. "You know, we could help other people. People who don't have anyone to fight for them." Emily turned to him, curious. Like what? Like making sure other families don't go through what we did. Starting something. A foundation, maybe. A way to make sure innocent people get a chance to be heard. Emily thought about it. About what it felt like when no one believed her, when everyone assumed the worst. She thought about how easy it was for the truth to get buried under fear and lies. She looked back at her father and nodded. Yeah. I'd like that. And for the first time in a long time, she felt lighter. Like maybe, just maybe, something good could come from everything they had been through. Because sometimes, the truth wasn't just about setting one person free. It was about making sure no one else had to fight the same battle alone. Justice is not always an easy path. It demands courage, persistence, and sometimes even a willingness to stand alone against the tide. For Emily, the battle to clear her father's name was more than just proving his innocence. It was about holding onto the belief that the truth could prevail, even when the world seemed determined to bury it. Through her journey, Emily learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the ability to move forward despite it. She had felt fear in the courtroom, in the whispers behind her back, and the long nights where doubt tried to creep in. But she had also felt determination, an unshakable resolve to uncover the truth. It was that resolve that made all the difference. Too often, people assume that justice is automatic, that the truth will reveal itself without effort. But Emily's story proves otherwise. Without her persistence, without her willingness to question what others accepted as fact, her father might still be behind bars. Sometimes, justice needs a voice willing to speak up, even when no one else is listening. Her story serves as a reminder that even the smallest voices can make the loudest impact. That the truth, no matter how deeply hidden, can always find its way to the surface. But it takes people willing to search for it, to fight for it, to believe in it even when the odds seem impossible. As Emily sat beside her father on the porch, feeling the warmth of his presence once more, she realized something important. Justice isn't just about punishment or verdicts. It's about restoring what was lost, about healing the wounds left behind. It was about her family, about finding their way back to each other after everything they had endured. The reunion was not just about freedom, it was about faith. Faith that no matter how dark things seemed, there was always a way forward. Faith that the bonds of love and family were stronger than any accusation or doubt. The hardest battles often teach the most profound lessons, and for Emily, that lesson was clear. Justice isn't just about winning a case, it's about finding truth and holding on to what truly matters. Life would never return to exactly what it had been before. There were scars, memories of nights filled with fear, of days spent in uncertainty. But there was also a newfound strength in her family, a deeper understanding of what it meant to stand by one another. They had faced the storm and come out stronger, not just because they had won, but because they had fought together. Now, as she looked ahead, Emily knew her story wasn't just hers alone. There were others out there who needed someone to believe in them, who needed someone to fight for justice. And maybe, just maybe, her story could inspire them to speak up, to hold on, to fight for what was right. If you believe that justice is worth fighting for, share this story. Let others see that even when the odds seem stacked against us, truth and courage can still win the day. Because sometimes, all it takes is one voice to change everything.